The disappearance of the MV Derbyshire stands as one of the most haunting enigmas in the history of the merchant marine, a mystery that for decades defied explanation and left a void in the hearts of 44 families. Launched in 1976 from the renowned Swan Hunter shipyard at Wallsend, England, the Derbyshire was a titan of the seas. As a bridge-class or bulk oil (OBO) carrier, she was a marvel of mid-century naval architecture, stretching nearly 300 meters in length and boasting a deadweight tonnage of over 169,000 tons. She was twice the size of the Titanic and built with the sturdy, double-hulled confidence of a vessel that many believed was fundamentally unsinkable. In July 1980, under the command of Captain Underhill, she departed from Sept Îles, Canada, laden with 157,000 tons of iron ore concentrate destined for Kawasaki, Japan. The voyage was routine, the crew was experienced, and the ship was only 4 years old, practically new by industry standards. However, as she neared the end of her journey in September 1980, the Derbyshire sailed directly into the path of Typhoon Orchid. On September 9th, the vessel sent a routine position report via radio, indicating she was hove to, riding out the storm approximately 230 miles off Okinawa. There was no distress signal, no frantic mayday, and no indication that the ship was in anything other than a standard heavy weather maneuver. Then, silence. When the storm subsided, the Derbyshire had vanished. Despite an extensive aerial and sea search that covered thousands of square miles, the only evidence found was a drifting oil slick. There were no lifeboats, no debris, and no survivors. The British government's initial formal investigation was tragically brief, concluding that the ship was likely overwhelmed by the phenomenal force of the typhoon, effectively blaming the elements and, by extension, the seamanship of the crew. The overwhelmed by weather verdict was a bitter pill for the families of the lost crew, organized as the Derbyshire Family Association, DFA. They refused to believe that a ship of such immense scale and modern construction could simply disappear without a trace unless there was a catastrophic structural failure. Their suspicions were galvanized by a chilling pattern involving the Derbyshire's sister ships. In 1982, the Tyne Bridge suffered severe structural cracking in its deck plating, and most significantly, the Kowloon Bridge, another identical sister ship, was lost off the coast of Ireland after developing massive cracks in the hull. The common denominator in these failures was a specific point known as Frame 65, the bulkhead, where the forward section of the engine room met the cargo holds. Engineers and whistleblowers suggested that the design of the bridge-class vessels featured a stress concentration at this junction, a flaw that could cause the ship to snap in two under the rhythmic pounding of heavy seas. The DFA argued that the Derbyshire hadn't been swallowed by waves. They believed she had broken her back at Frame 65, plunging to the bottom so rapidly that the crew never had a chance to reach the lifeboats or the radio. For 14 years, the UK government resisted calls for a new inquiry, citing a lack of physical evidence. To the authorities, the Derbyshire was a needle in a haystack, resting in the deep-water trenches of the Philippine Sea where salvage or even visualization was deemed impossible. The deadlock was finally broken not by the government, but by the persistence of the families and the financial backing of the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF. In 1994, a search mission was launched, led by the renowned American oceanographer David Mearns and the specialized salvage firm Blue Water Recoveries. The technical challenges were staggering. The search area was located in the Dragon's Triangle, an area characterized by volatile weather and extreme depths reaching 4,000 meters over 13,000 feet below the surface. At this depth, the water pressure is a crushing 400 atmospheres, and the environment is pitch black. The team utilized the Ocean Explorer, a deep-towed side-scan sonar vehicle, to map the seabed. For days, the mission teetered on the edge of failure as the sonar returned images of a featureless, silty plain. However, on June 3, 1994, the sonar picked up a scatter of highly reflective objects. As the team deployed the remotely operated vehicle ROV to descend to the site, the first images returned to the surface were surreal. They didn't see a ship, they saw an industrial graveyard. The Derbyshire had not sunk intact. The wreckage was shattered into thousands of pieces, scattered across a debris field that stretched for nearly a kilometer. The discovery of the stern section, clearly bearing the name Derbyshire and the port of registry Liverpool, provided the first closure the families had felt in over a decade. But the state of the wreck also raised a terrifying new question. What kind of force could tear 90,000 tons of steel into fragments the size of a suitcase? The 1,994 images were enough to force the British government to reopen the case, leading to a massive, multi-million-pound forensic expedition in 1997. This second phase was a masterclass in deep-sea engineering, utilizing the Jason ROV from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. The goal was to perform a photogrammetric survey, a process of taking tens of thousands of high-resolution still images to create a 3D reconstruction of the debris field. As the forensic team analyzed the twisted remains, they quickly identified the cause of the ship's fragmentation: compressive implosion. As the Derbyshire began its final descent, the air-filled spaces within the hull, the wing tanks, the double bottoms, and the cofferdams, were subjected to rapidly increasing external pressure. Because the ship was sinking so quickly, there was no time for the pressure to equalize. At a depth of roughly 100 meters, the hull's integrity failed simultaneously across multiple sections. The resulting implosions were so violent they acted like internal explosions, blowing the ship apart from the inside out. This explained why the wreckage was so pulverized, but it also shifted the focus of the investigation. To find the first cause, the team had to look away from the shattered midsection and toward the parts of the ship that had survived the descent with the most clarity: the bow and the hatch covers. It was here, in the cold dark of the Pacific floor, that the investigation would finally uncover the fatal flaw that changed maritime law forever. As the 1,997 investigation progressed, the forensic team, led by Professor Douglas Faulkner, began to look past the dramatic devastation of the midsection to focus on the smaller, seemingly mundane components of the forward deck. The prevailing Frame 65 theory, which suggested the ship snapped in half due to structural brittle fracture, began to lose ground when the high-resolution mapping of the seabed failed to show the specific type of tearing associated with a surface break at that location. Instead, the team became fascinated by the condition of the air pipes on the forecastle. These pipes, designed to allow the fuel and ballast tanks to breathe by letting air escape as liquid was pumped in, were located on the most exposed part of the ship. The ROV footage revealed that many of these pipes had been sheared off at the deck level or had their protective mushroom covers crushed. In the mountainous seas of Typhoon Orchid, the Derbyshire would have been taking green water, solid, massive waves directly over her bow. The forensic engineers calculated that the force of these waves exceeded the pipe's design strength by a factor of 10. Once these pipes were compromised, they became open conduits, allowing hundreds of tons of seawater to pour directly into the forward compartments of the ship. This was the silent beginning of the end. The water ingress was not enough to sink the ship immediately, but it was enough to change her trim, pulling the bow deeper into the water and making the ship even more vulnerable to the next wave. With the bow now riding dangerously low due to the flooded forward tanks, the Derbyshire was no longer able to ride the waves. Instead, she began to plow through them. This created a catastrophic feedback loop. The deeper the bow sank, the more water the deck took on, and the more the air pipes flooded. The investigation then turned its attention to the massive cargo hatch covers the steel plates that sealed the 9 immense holds containing 157,000 tons of iron ore. Under international maritime regulations at the time, hatch cover strength was calculated based on a ship's freeboard, or height above the water. The assumption was that the covers only needed to support the weight of a certain amount of water sitting on them. However, the forensic team discovered that these regulations had failed to account for dynamic loading. When a ship is trimmed by the head in a typhoon, the waves don't just sit on the hatches, they slam into them with the force of a falling building. By analyzing the crumpled remains of the one hatch cover on the ocean floor, the team realized that the steel had buckled under a pressure of nearly 4 tons per square meter, far beyond what it was built to withstand. When the one hatch failed, the ship's largest empty space was suddenly open to the Pacific. The failure of the first hatch cover was the definitive point of no return. As hold one filled with thousands of tons of seawater in a matter of seconds, the weight became insurmountable. The bow was pulled down at a steep angle, effectively planting the front of the ship into the water. This exposed the two hatch cover to the same terminal forces that had destroyed the first. One by one, like a row of falling dominoes, the forward hatches gave way. The forensic reconstruction suggests that the Derbyshire didn't just sink, she was pulled under by her own weight in a terrifyingly rapid sequence. The bridge, located nearly 300 meters away at the stern, would have been thrust high into the air as the bow plummeted. For the 44 crew members, there would have been no time for a coordinated evacuation. The internal bulkheads, never designed to hold back the weight of the entire ocean, would have collapsed under the hydrostatic pressure as the ship left the surface. By the time the Derbyshire reached a depth of 100 meters, the implosion phase began, shattering the hull and scattering the cargo into the 4,000-meter abyss. The investigation had finally solved the how. It wasn't a snap in the middle, but a failure at the front. The findings of the Derbyshire investigation were not just a technical victory, they were a direct challenge to the global shipping establishment. The investigation proved that the load line convention of 1966, which set the standards for hatch cover strength, was fundamentally flawed and dangerously outdated for the new generation of Capesize bulk carriers. The industry had built ships that were bigger and heavier, but they had not scaled up the strength of the vital components that kept the water out. The British government and the International Maritime Organization, IMO, were forced to face a hard truth. The Derbyshire was a victim of legal design flaws. The crew hadn't been negligent. They had been sent to sea in a vessel that was technically compliant with the law, but physically incapable of surviving a major typhoon once a few small air pipes failed. This revelation sparked a massive push for reform. The forensic evidence from 4,000 meters deep was so undeniable that it bypassed the usual decades of bureaucratic stalling, leading to some of the most significant changes in maritime safety history. The most profound victory of the 1997 investigation was not just technical, but moral. For nearly 20 years, the official record had left a cloud of implied negligence over Captain Underhill and his crew. By proving that the ship had succumbed to a cascading failure of air pipes and hatch covers components, the crew could neither see nor reinforce in the middle of a typhoon. The forensic team provided the evidence needed for a formal exoneration. In 2000, the reopened High Court inquest officially concluded that the Derbyshire was lost due to structural inadequate strength of the hatches, and not because of any failure in seamanship. This verdict was a monumental moment for the Derbyshire Family Association. They had fought a David versus Goliath battle against the British government and the global shipping industry, and they had won. The families finally had a definitive answer to take to the memorial at the Church of Street. Nicholas in Liverpool. Their loved ones weren't responsible for the tragedy. They were victims of a design that was legal on paper but lethal in practice. The impact of the Derbyshire investigation rippled through the International Maritime Organization, IMO, and led to some of the most sweeping changes to the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS. In the modern era, the data recovered from 4,000 meters deep proved that the existing standards for hatch cover strength were catastrophically low for large bulk carriers. As a direct result, new regulations were implemented requiring a massive increase in the strength of hatch covers on the forward part of all new and existing bulk carriers. Furthermore, the design of air pipes and their protective covers was completely overhauled to ensure they could withstand the green water loading of a Force 12 storm. The Capesize vessels that followed the Derbyshire were built with reinforced bows and higher bulwarks to deflect the power of the ocean. These weren't just incremental improvements. They were fundamental shifts in naval architecture that have undoubtedly saved thousands of mariners' lives in the decades since. The Derbyshire became the Titanic of bulk carriers, a tragedy so well documented and scientifically analyzed that it forced the world to change how it built its ships. Beyond maritime safety, the Derbyshire investigation set a new gold standard for deep-sea forensics. It proved that with the right technology and a meticulous, data-driven approach, the ocean floor could be treated like a terrestrial crime scene. The process of using side-scan sonar, ROV photogrammetry, and computer-aided wreckage reassembly paved the way for future investigations, including the search for the El Faro in 2015 and the Stellar Daisy in 2019. The Derbyshire mission demonstrated that no depth was too great to hide the truth, provided there was the political and social will to find it. The investigation moved the field of maritime archaeology into the realm of high-stakes engineering forensics, where the goal wasn't just to find a ship, but to understand the physics of its destruction to prevent the next disaster. Today, the MV Derbyshire remains at the bottom of the Pacific, a silent monument to the 44 lives lost on that September day in 1980. The debris field, once a site of intense scientific scrutiny, is now recognized as a maritime grave. The investigation did more than just fix hatch covers. It gave the families the peace that comes with the truth. They proved that their brothers, fathers, and husbands were not taken by a freak of nature or a mistake at the helm, but by a failure of industrial foresight. The 4,000-meter deep investigation remains a testament to the power of persistence, a reminder that the sea may be deep and the storms may be powerful, but the human drive for justice and the precision of modern science can reach even the darkest corners of the earth. The Derbyshire is gone, but the lessons learned from her shattered hull continue to protect every sailor who heads into the horizon today. To understand why the Derbyshire failed, one must understand the era of its birth. The 1,970 seconds were a period of rapid scaling in naval architecture. Shipyards were moving away from traditional, smaller cargo vessels toward Cape-size bulkers vessels so large they could not fit through the Panama or Suez canals. The Derbyshire was a flagship of this bridge-class generation. The design used a massive open-hold structure. While this was efficient for loading iron ore, it created enormous internal volumes. Naval architects at the time relied heavily on static calculations, assuming that if a ship was big enough, it would simply ride over the weather. They underestimated the dynamic environment of a typhoon, where waves do not just wash over a deck, but slam into it with the force of several hundred tons of falling concrete. The Frame 65 theory, while eventually disproven as the primary cause of the Derbyshire's sinking, was based on real engineering flaws found in her sisters. At Frame 65, there was a misalignment between the longitudinal girders of the engine room and the cargo holds. In the sister ship Tyne Bridge, inspectors found that the steel was literally tearing itself apart at this junction. This highlighted a period where bigger didn't necessarily mean stronger, as the industry struggled to understand how such massive hulls flexed in a seaway. The forensic investigation's discovery of compressive implosion was a landmark in maritime science. To visualize this, one must imagine the ship not as a solid block of steel, but as a series of interconnected bubbles. When the Derbyshire left the surface, her ballast tanks and cofferdams, void spaces between compartments, were filled with air at 1 atmosphere of pressure. As she plummeted toward the 4,000-meter floor, the external water pressure mounted at a rate of 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. By the time the ship reached 100 meters, the pressure on the hull was roughly 11 atmospheres. The steel plating, weakened by the massive weight of the 157,000 tons of iron ore pulling it down, reached its buckling point. When the first void space failed, it didn't just leak, it collapsed at supersonic speeds. This created internal shock waves that shattered the surrounding steel. This is why the wreckage wasn't found in large chunks like the Titanic, but in thousands of small, jagged fragments. The Derbyshire essentially exploded inward before it even reached the deep ocean. The 1,994 and 1,997 missions were turning points for oceanographic technology. David Mearns and his team had to contend with the Dragon's Triangle, an area of the Pacific known for underwater mountains and unpredictable currents. The primary tool for the initial discovery was the side-scan sonar. Unlike traditional sonar, which looks straight down, side-scan sonar is towed behind a ship and sends out fan-shaped pulses to the sides, creating a shaded map of the seafloor's texture. In the 1997 mission, the use of the Jason ROV, remotely operated vehicle, allowed for the first-ever deep-sea photogrammetric survey. This involved grid mapping. The ROV flew a precise lawnmower pattern over the kilometer-long debris field. 2. High-resolution imaging, capturing over 130,000 individual photographs. 3. Digital reassembly, using computers to stitch these photos into a seamless 3D map. This allowed investigators to see the crush patterns on the hatch covers. By looking at the direction the steel was bent, they could determine that the pressure came from above, the waves, rather than from within, the cargo shifting. The most chilling aspect of the Derbyshire report was that such a massive vessel was brought down by the failure of components only a few centimeters thick, the air pipes. Bulk carriers have air pipes on the forward deck to prevent a vacuum from forming in the ballast tanks. On the Derbyshire, These were fitted with mushroom heads. The investigation proved that these heads were the ship's Achilles heel. During the typhoon, as the bow dipped into the waves, the sheer weight of the water snapped these pipes off. Once the pipes were gone, the ship began to inhale the ocean. Calculations showed that as much as 400 tons of water per hour were pouring into the forwardmost section of the ship. This caused the trim of the ship to shift. A ship is designed to sit level. As the bow filled, the Derbyshire began to tilt forward. This tilt made the forward cargo hatches, the No. 1 and No. 2 hatches, the primary targets for every subsequent wave. The 1966 International Load Line Convention was the law of the sea at the time. It mandated that hatch covers must withstand a certain amount of weight. However, it assumed static loading, the weight of water just sitting there. The Derbyshire forensics proved the reality of dynamic loading. When a 160,000-ton ship meets a 30-meter wave, the energy transfer is equivalent to a massive hammer blow. The No. 1 hatch cover, weakened by the ship's forward tilt, was struck by a green water surge that exceeded its breaking point by hundreds of %. When the No. 1 hatch buckled, the ship's fate was sealed in seconds. Iron ore is incredibly dense. It leaves a lot of air space in a hold. When that air was replaced by seawater, the weight increased so rapidly that the ship's bow essentially became a lead weight, pulling the rest of the vessel vertically into the abyss. For the families in Liverpool, the technical details were a means to an end, the clearing of their loved ones' names. For years, the shipping industry had whispered that the crew had failed to batten down the hatches or had maneuvered poorly. The 1997 report completely dismantled these claims. It showed that the crew followed every standard procedure. They were hove to, the safest position for a ship in a storm. They had no way of knowing the air pipes had failed, as the bow was 200 meters away and obscured by spray and darkness. The exoneration in 2000 was a landmark legal victory, shifting the blame from human error to design error. The global impact. SOLAS and the new bulk carrier standards. The Derbyshire findings led to the IMO's Bulk Carrier Safety, Chapter the 12th of SOLAS. This was one of the most expensive and comprehensive safety overhauls in history. 1. Hatch cover reinforcement. All bulk carriers over 150 meters were required to have their forward hatch covers reinforced with additional steel stiffeners. 2. Water level detectors. Ships were required to install sensors in forward holds and void spaces that would sound an alarm on the bridge if even a small amount of water entered. This solved the silent flooding problem that killed the Derbyshire. 3. Double-side skins. New regulations pushed for ships to have a double skin, 2 layers of steel on the sides, to prevent a single puncture from sinking the vessel. 4. The investigation changed how we approach modern maritime disasters. When the U.S.-flagged ship El Faro vanished in a hurricane in 2015, the search team used the Derbyshire Protocol. They didn't just look for the hull, they looked for the debris field to find the first failure point. 5. The Derbyshire proved that even at 4,000 meters, the ocean floor is a witness. The data-driven approach, used by Professor Douglas Faulkner and David Mearns, turned ship-sinking investigations into a rigorous branch of engineering. The MV Derbyshire remains a somber reminder of the limits of human engineering. It took 20 years, 2 major expeditions, and the tireless work of grieving families to solve a mystery that the world had dismissed as an act of God. By finding the wreck in the Dragon's Triangle, investigators did more than solve a cold case. They protected every future mariner. Today, when a bulk carrier safely weathers a massive storm, it does so because of the lessons paid for by the 44 lives lost on the Derbyshire. The investigation proved that in the face of the overwhelming power of the ocean, our greatest defense is not just thick steel, but the relentless pursuit of the truth, no matter how deep it is buried.